We've got some Steam Deck updates, plus some new tech, some good news for the industry, and some bad news. SteamOS just got another update with a boatload of fixes, including black screen issues that people were having when launching games like Forza Horizon 4. There were also issues where people's SD cards would be essentially invisible in SteamOS. So if that was you, hopefully you didn't assume that it was a bad card and return it, because it looks like it was an OS level issue. They also added a slider in order to change the brightness of the charging LED. People with the semi-transparent OLED edition were complaining that you could see the LED when playing. Now you can dim it down so it doesn't show up as much, although I kind of liked the way that it looked. They also improved performance on a bunch of games, including Persona 3 Reload. The performance overlay was giving people false impressions as it was accidentally reporting instantaneous measurements instead of averages. And they also fixed HDR being super saturated when you were using DisplayPort. They made the color mapping for HDR titles better. They improved corner tracking on the Steam Deck OLED trackpads, and they dropped a bunch of bug fixes related to USB issues. Bad news if you live in Germany. There are now requirements that all games have to be rated by the ratings board over there. This itself isn't necessarily an issue. This comes to us from Liam over at Gaming on Linux. I like the idea that game ratings exist. That way customers know exactly what they're getting. The problem is that it also applies to older games, meaning that the thousands of unrated games on Steam have to now be rated. They can either be rated by the rating board in the particular countries. I think it was Brazil and Germany that we're talking about here, although it seems like it's a lot easier for devs or publishers to just use Steam's built-in system. The issue that arises is, what about the games where the company doesn't have the manpower to go back and do this for their old games, or companies where those games, like the companies no longer exist, but you can still download those games from Steam? Will those games simply vanish on Steam? If you're in one of the affected countries, that might actually be what happens. So you'll want to check out the sponsor of this episode. I'm just kidding. There's no actual sponsor on this episode, although I will say now is a good time to check out that join button down below. PC games are about to get a boost from Microsoft as they are working on a way to make it easier for devs to make games that support resolution upscaling. Currently, there are a lot of different ways to upscale games to higher resolutions, so you can run a game at, say, 1080p and then have it upscaled to 4K so it looks a little bit less blurry. You can use tech like XeSS, FSR, or DLSS, and a bunch of other letter combinations that I'm sure that I don't know about. Microsoft calls this new API DirectSR, and they're working with NVIDIA and AMD and Intel in order to make a common language of inputs and outputs, basically allowing devs to write code for upscaling just one time, and then the end user can choose which upscaling option to use. I think that this is a great idea, and I hope that Valve duplicates this API in Proton. For those that are unaware what Proton is, I'll give a quick explanation, but if you already know, stick around and let me know if I get anything wrong. Essentially, Proton translates Windows API calls to Linux API calls. This is why PC games that are written in with Windows in mind are able to run on SteamOS, Valve's custom version of Linux. At this point, I don't know that Linux has a similar API call that can do exactly what this is doing. We don't know how Windows is going to accomplish this. But hopefully, once they make it available, Valve or the people working on VKD3D can implement it easily, because this sounds like a great way to improve performance on any game that uses this API call. I was talking to my buddy Kerry, who's on the NerdNest podcast with me, and he said, I wager that getting Proton to support DirectSR would be trivial. More bad news for the industry. AEA, boy, oh boy, they're laying off 670 employees, which is about 5% of their workforce. The CEO, Andrew Wilson, who earned over $20 million in 2023, sent out a company-wide letter saying that they are ditching some live service titles as well as moving away from more licensed IP that they don't believe will be successful in changing their industry. One game that is absolutely getting the axe is Respawn's upcoming Star Wars first-person shooter. I am disappointed, as that game was to be helmed by Peter Hirschman, who previously worked on Medal of Honor games as well as Star Wars Battlefront. I know that Star Wars Battlefront didn't go over too well, the most recent version, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. Sure, EA did try to ruin the fun with terrible microtransactions and pay-to-win mechanics, but the community pushed back and they dropped it. Unfortunately, the damage was done, and people just didn't give the game much of a chance after that. This is just the latest in a slew of layoffs that have plagued the first couple of months of 2024. And as of the time that I'm recording this, over 8,000 jobs have been lost in the gaming industry. In just the first 2 months of the year, Sony, Microsoft, and many others have made huge cuts, with Sony unveiling that they kept their massive costs at bay by firing people, and they still only had a 6% profit margin. I think too many companies are focusing on a handful of massive AAA or quadruple A games, and if they don't hit like they're projected to, or if they take too long to make, then the damage that's done to the company's coffers is just too great. I would love to see these companies focus on smaller games with less detailed graphics that aren't designed to be 300 hours long. Yes, I know that there are tons of indie games to play. I'll talk more about some indie games down later on in the show. But the AAA mindset that the current big studios seem to have, it just isn't sustainable. But even if companies do focus on smaller games, the fact that they're just publicly traded companies expands all of these issues. I keep seeing people say that this is a video game crash like we had in 1983, but that isn't what's happening here. I think Jeff Grubbs said it best on Twitter. He said you can't have a crash, at least in the US, when the market was up 4% year over year in 2023. That is the opposite of a crash. This is executives mimicking growth by cutting costs. The insistence that companies constantly have to have growth is completely unsustainable. You cannot keep getting bigger and bigger, especially in the gaming industry, since it isn't getting new customers. So in order to have bigger profits, which they have to do in order to satisfy shareholders, then they have to cut people, add microtransactions on top of $70 price tags, and that just isn't something that can keep going up. All of this stems from publicly traded companies needing to answer to shareholders. Shareholders don't care about games. They don't care about the industry. They just care about getting a return on their investment. And I don't think that there is anything that can be done about this, except to have privately owned companies. More on that later. Speaking of massive AAA games that take way too many hours to finish, I've got a review copy of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Big thanks to Square for sending it over. I will be talking about it at some point in the near future, maybe on the next episode of the NerdNest podcast. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you click on that subscribe button down below. Over 50% of my viewers that watch my content are not subscribed, but I recently asked you guys to subscribe, and this month has been my biggest growth for subscribers that the NerdNest has had in over 2 years. So a huge thank you to everybody who clicked that button and is helping out. I've also started playing Balatro, is I think the way to say it. I received a review copy of the game from the publisher, and it's an actually really interesting concept. It's a roguelike poker game. You have a series of bosses, or which are called blinds, which you can then battle against, and you can skip the lower blinds for a chance at loot. But the higher blinds have mechanics that you have to kind of plan around. The game board is your hand of a bunch of cards, which you can select up to 5 cards to play poker hands. You then use special cards that you get in each run that will give you passive bonuses or active bonuses, and you have a limited number of hands and a limited number of discards in order to meet the blind. If you fail, it's game over, you start a new run. The game is very small, simple to understand, but has a really fun gameplay loop and really robust risk-reward systems. I highly recommend it as the perfect game to throw on your Steam Deck, ROG Ally, Legion Go, or whatever other handheld PC that you're using, and play a game while you're watching your favorite podcast. Helldivers 2 seems to have finally found its footing after the nightmare scenario of servers being absolutely overwhelmed. Arrowhead Studios has managed to increase capacity, and last night when I logged on, I didn't have to wait at all to kill some robots and bugs. Now they've got the servers under control over at Arrowhead, they can start focusing on changing the game. And they're changing the game in real time. According to an interview with PC Gamer, they have a guy working at Arrowhead named Joe, and he's pulling all the strings on the galactic scale, pushing players to defend their favorite planets. But it isn't just this weird overarching story that's happening. Arrowhead CEO Jonathan Pielstedt, I think I might have said that wrong. I'm sorry if I did. He says that it's kind of like D&D, although you can't get as personal. They're reacting to the players just as much as the players are reacting to them. He didn't want to give away too much information, though, as he wanted to keep things fresh and exciting so they can surprise and delight us. One thing they've got to do is convince toxic players to stop killing each other for drops. Every bit of loot in Helldivers 2 is shared, but players keep killing each other for it. On top of that, players are getting booted from parties for not having meta builds. Basically, the game is suffering from farmers that just can't seem to have fun. It's strange because Arrowhead specifically said they didn't want toxic behavior, which is why they wouldn't bring PvP into the game. But it seems like any amount of success brings out the farmers. That will, oh my God, they'll just have to find a way to maximize. They have to find a way to maximize every single moment of gaming. Can't we just have fun, people? All right, let's pivot to some great news, because this has been kind of a dour stuff for the industry lately. I've got a trio of stories all about game devs gaining control of their own destiny, starting with Remedy. Control is now under control of Remedy Games. The devs previously acquired the rights to Alan Wake from the publisher. This means that any future Control games will be totally controlled by Remedy. Remedy says this transaction will enable us to negotiate better deals for current and future Control games. We can now weigh up the options between self-publishing and new publishing partner for Condor and Control 2, and at the same time, we are in better negotiating position than before, as Control is an established brand and Alan Wake 2 has been successful. They went on to say that both Control 2 and Condor are both still being developed, and now that Alan Wake 2 is done, they have a lot more people working on those projects. But Remedy isn't the only company with good news to report. Saber Interactive is buying themselves from the Embracer Group for $500 million. If you didn't know who Saber is, they're the company working on the remake of the Knights of the Old Republic. According to Jason Schreier, the Star Wars game is still alive, but between now and whenever, anything can happen. It's also being reported that Borderlands dev Gearbox is being sold to a new third party, and Toys for Bob, the devs behind Spyro Remastered and Crash Bandicoot, are going independent as well. This is what the industry needs: more devs that are in charge of their own games. I know that this seems odd coming from me, as I wanted Microsoft to acquire Activision, but that was because I didn't like what was happening with Activision, and it was just trading one big conglomerate for another, and I was hoping for some changes there. What I really would have preferred is if Blizzard would be spun out as an independent, as well as all the other companies and IP that were gobbled up first by Activision and then by Microsoft. But what do you think? Do devs that are currently controlled by what devs that are currently controlled by big publishers would you like to see go independent? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy this one right here. I screwed up at the end. I made it through this entire video without a big screw up, hoping to not edit at all. From the NerdNest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, everybody.